So the first thing that we understood here is like a Spring MVC project. Okay, a Spring MVC project is where we initially added all the required dependent libraries. So once we are done with adding the libraries, the second step that we did is like configured a web.xml page. So a web.xml is a configuration file where every initial request will come to this file. So for the first time, when a request comes to this application, okay, when a request comes to this application, let me run it and show you. So what happens here is whenever a request comes here for the first time, okay, to web.xml, in the web.xml, ideally it calls the index.jsp. So now if I see my index.jsp in my application, I just configured that, hey, go ahead and do a page forward to a request called forward to login page. This is a simple forward tag that I have written. So index.jsp again sends a request onto the server saying that forward to login page. Now again, once the request comes to the web.xml, it checks if it is a valid URL pattern or not. If it is a valid URL pattern, then it will go ahead and call the dispatcher servlet given by the Spring framework. So once the dispatcher servlet gets the actual request, then it will read the configuration file like call the Spring servlet -servlet.xml. It will call this XML file. So once this XML file is called, the basic scenario here is the most common thing is like all the required configurations are written in this XML file. So now in this XML file, what did we say? We wrote something called as an annotation driven saying that, hey, we are all using annotations, and we told the dispatcher servlet to do a component scan, search for some components like if you notice, we wrote something like we can write something like at the rate component, at the rate controller, at the rate service, at the rate repository, right? So in this current package com.easylearnjava.controller, in this package we do have four classes ABC, BBC, login controller and register controller, out of which only two classes, login controller and register controller, only these two classes are annotated with at the rate controller, which means the dispatcher servlet identifies that these two are the controller classes which are eligible to be called by the dispatcher servlet. Now, once I say that these two can be called by the dispatcher servlet, the next question is, hey, in this current context, when I'm getting a URL like forward to login page, okay, so what is that I'm getting? Forward to login page. This is the request that I'm getting. So once I get a request, which controller class can be called? Okay, so in login controller, it has identified that there is a method which is annotated with @request mapping and has a value called forward to login page. So this is the method which will be called, and since I am sending a get request also, everything matches at line number 17 and the bind form will be called. So understand the scenario here. What are we trying to do in the bind form? So in the bind form, there are two things that we are doing. We are creating a model and a view. Okay. What is the view that we are creating? The view that we are saying here is, hey, go ahead and display a view called login to the user. Okay. Login means ultimately, if you remember yesterday, I told a concept where if I return back login, okay, if I return back login, there is a concept of internal resource view resolver, which will take the concept of prefix and suffix, okay, prefix and suffix. So let me just show you once again. In this view resolver, which is given by Spring, we are using something called as internal resource view resolver. So in that view resolver, it has a prefix called webinf/views and .jsp. So it will build this path and it will look for a page called login.jsp under webinf under views. So that is being built by, or that is being displayed to the user. So what are we basically doing in this controller class? In the controller class, the first step that we are trying to do here is model.add attribute, sorry, return login. So we are building a view, and the next one we are doing here is we are trying to attach a model to the view. So when I am saying I'm attaching a model, which means that what exactly model does? Model is able to bind the data which the user has entered in the UI, right? So what is the data that the user is entering? The data that the user is entering is nothing but the username and password. So to store username and password which the user is entering in the JSP page, I have created something called a login page, where in the login page, in the login.jsp, all I did is like I created a username and password input fields, and these inputs I want to store into the properties called username property and password property in the login form Java class. So what I do here is I am creating a model and view. This is the base concept in Spring. In Spring, you can return back a model view object. So what is the model that you are setting? You are setting a model is nothing but a login form. So you are binding an empty login form to a login.jsp page, so that any data that you enter in the JSP page can be bound to that login form. So what is the key that you are assigning? Telling model object form. So now if you go back to, if I execute this completely, it returns back a login and it displays login.jsp back to the user. Now along with the login.jsp, if you go back to login.jsp page and notice, there is something else that I have written called as command name as model object form. So this command name actually helps us in binding the form to the page. Okay, so whatever data you enter will be bound to this model object form. But what exactly is model object form? If you understand, model object form is ideally nothing but, if you go to controller at line number 19, you told it is nothing but a new login form object that you have created. Okay, so that is how data is bound here, and it will be sent to the server once you enter the data. So now in this scenario, what I will do here is I will enter some data called Raghu, and I say secret and say login to my app. I click on submit button. So once I click on this submit button, the next thing that I'm going to do here is, see, in the login.jsp page, okay, what is that I'm trying to say? I'm sending a URL called, or I'm sending a request called login to the server. So the same old concept again. Once the request called login comes to the server, again the request is given to dispatcher servlet reads this one and understands that there is a URL pattern called login that it needs to handle. Now in the login controller, you have mapped two methods, one at line number 24 and the one at line number 40. Both methods can handle a request called login. Now the dispatcher servlet needs to decide, hey, which method needs to be called. So the method that needs to be called is nothing but a request called login, but it is a post request. So method at line number 24 is being called. And once the request comes to this method, the first and the foremost thing always that you need to do is data validation. So you need to validate the data. So we write something called as @valid. If you write @valid, it means you want to validate something. So what exactly are you validating? There are two things that you wrote here. One annotation is @valid to validate, and here you are telling @model attribute. Okay, so what is this? which brings data 2 and 4th. The data is nothing but the model. Data is present inside a model. So we define here saying that the model attribute is the model obj form, which you have already defined or attached here in the JSP page. So it brings the data for you. So when you go back to this one, so it brings the data which is present in the login form, which is nothing but the form object. Okay, login form object. So now, since you wrote at the rate valid, what happens is the data present in this form will be validated. So now once I go to the login form .java class, here I again wrote some annotations at the rate not empty, at the rate size. See, I wrote some custom annotations, some specific annotations here, which will do validations for me. If I want, I can always go ahead and search for some conditions like is username null or not, but still instead of doing all those coding, we can use some pre-existing validations, okay, annotations for doing validations. So I use these validations. Now the next concept, if there are any errors, during the data validation, the errors will be stored in this result, which is of type binding result object. Okay, all the errors during the data validation will be stored in the result. So the next immediate step inside the process form, or the first step that I do here is, hey, result dot has errors. I'm checking, hey, are there any errors in the data which is coming from the login page or not? If there are any errors, then what I need to do, I need to send back those errors to the login page. Why? Because the user is coming from the login page. So what I do, I just return login. Again, once I return back login, the dispatcher servlet takes this string, goes to this XML file, and again takes the help of internal resource view resolver, builds a view or builds the path saying that webinf slash views slash login dot JSP, and will display that page. So once the login page is displayed back to the user, there are some predefined tags that you are using, form colon errors. So based on the errors, they will be displayed back to the user, like if it is for username or password or whatever, right? So let me go ahead and go back to the login controller and explain one more simple concept. If there are any errors, then you go back to the login page. If all the validations go fine, then the result object will not contain any errors. If it does not contain any errors, then everything is good and you can perform all your logic, whatever logic you want to write, and then return back. If it is success, you can return back login success. Again, if you are returning back login success, it is given back to the dispatcher servlet, where the dispatcher servlet takes this string, goes to this XML and checks this internal resource view resolver, asks it to build a path which will build as webinf slash views slash login success dot JSP. So if you see here, webinf slash views slash login success dot JSP. So if everything goes good, this success page is displayed back to the user. So let me just go ahead and first show error scenario. I say RA and again some SEC. So I say log into my app. So it came to line number 26. Are there any errors in the validation? Yes, there are errors. If I hover my mouse on result object, it shows that, hey, there are two errors. The first one is basically for the password and the other one is basically for username, and the rejected values are SEC and RA. So there are two things it shows. The first one is like the size. The size is a problem, which shows like the size should be more, and the second one, it also shows like model object default message password. Yes, size, and it must also show the, oh okay, it only shows two error messages. I thought it must show also the not empty, but since it is not empty, it is not showing that. So things are good. So once I say complete this execution, it sends the request called login. So login.jsp is shown to the user. Sorry, This is the one which is shown to the user with some errors. So now let me go ahead and submit this with an empty password. So once I submit, it again does some validations. If you see the result, there are three errors in this concept. The three errors are, the first one is for username, okay, because the size must be 5 characters. The second one is for password, there are two errors. One is not empty error failed, and the size also validation failed. So all these three error messages will be displayed back in the JSP page. So see here, first error for username and two more errors for the password. May not be empty and size must be 5115. Okay. Now the next concept here is like how we can take the data which is coming from the form and send to the next additional layers and do our regular stuff. Okay. So is this clear to everyone like till this point? Yeah, let me take that question. Is there any specific reason for writing view resolver as ID in servlet.xml? We are not mapping this ID anyway, I guess. That's a good question. So we are not using this view resolver anywhere. So it's not always required to call this ID. Okay, ID is not required for in this context. So I can always say like I just need an internal resource view resolver. Okay, so in this concept, what happens is like the Spring container, sorry, the Spring dispatcher servlet calls this specific view resolver. So since we are not calling it, we don't need any specific ID for this. Okay. Now the next concept. So from here, what we will do is like we will try to create few more classes. Okay, and we'll try to understand the concept step by step. So the next thing that I create here is a package. Service and the package called DO. Okay. So service is where I write all my business logic, and DAO is where I write all my database logic. So let me do one thing. In my structs project, I copy the login service and just write it here. Okay. Oh, it has DAO and all. Okay. Let me just do one thing. Let me move it. And here the next set of code that I'm going to write is as important as how you understood the first part in Spring. Okay. Why? Because the second part mostly contains annotations which will inject or which will try to create objects which are done by the Spring container for you. Okay. So again, this
Hey
is,
Raghu,
yeah, go ahead.
hey, can you go back to Sai's question again? Uh,
Which one?
the questions Sai just asked about the view resolver.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the login.jsp. How does it call login.jsp and not something else?
Okay. So were you there from the beginning of the class or
Just today, yeah.
okay? So see here, what is the welcome file that we are calling?
The index.
Index. So once it goes to index.jsp, what is the URL that will be again sent to the server immediately?
The forward to login page?
Okay, so it comes to web.xml. It is a valid URL pattern. The dispatcher servlet will be called, and it will go ahead and read this. So my quick question, maybe I'm not going to say all those things, but my quick question is, once
Yeah, you don't have to.
this forward to login page comes, which will be called exactly? Which Java class will be called?
Um, I don't know, is it login controller?
Okay, okay. Uh,
No, I
yeah.
mean, my question is how you got the login.jsp, and then we also have another JSP file there, right? And then you only mentioned that it goes under suffix and prefix. That's what I wanted to know. How does it pick that particular suffix and prefix?
Okay, these
Just that
things.
part, yeah.
How does it?
Yeah, just that part.
Okay, this concept is like this is internally what Spring has defined for you. So that is what is taken care by the class which we have defined here. The internal resource view resolver based on these names. Prefix and suffix are the names which we need to give exactly. So based on these names, when someone sends ABC, it will look for a file called webinf/views slash abc.jsp. That is what it will look for.
Oh, okay, okay.
That is the
All
part.
right.
Do you remember actually? That's what I was explaining. So,
I just
so
saw this earlier, yeah.
yeah, that is the prefix and this is the suffix. In between,
Okay,
it is what is the controller returning back to us.
okay, okay. Gotcha.
Mhm. Yeah, that's good. So now, as I said, like I will be using few more annotations here. So understanding the annotations is very, very, very important. Why? Because these annotations are like, means this is how you code even in real time. So the way you code these annotations is like, means there are like a four annotations which you will be using mostly when you're dealing with Spring MVC. Okay. Now I go to login controller. Now the first question, login controller, when it gets the data, what is the next class in general this class needs to call? Any guess? So once I have the request in login controller, from login controller, what is the next class it needs to call? Anyone? So is it clear to everyone saying that login page? Okay, maybe my question might be a little bit wrong. So my question is like, once all the data is validated and everything is good in the login controller, what is the next steps that we need to perform? So the basic scenario, the answer is, once everything is good in login controller, all I do is I go ahead and call the next set of classes. Okay, I go to the login service. Okay, always remember, like we are trying to understand a specific architecture, right? So in structs, if you go back, once a request comes to action, from action it will call the service, from service it will call the DAO. Remember? So this is kind of an architecture in real time. If someone asks you what is your project architecture, you need to say a request comes from the JSP page to the web.xml given to the controller. Controller reads the configurations, calls the action class. From the action class, it calls the service class. From the service class, it calls the DAO class. The DAO class calls the database, and the database returns back to the DAO, and the DAO returns back to the service class. The service class returns back to the action class. The action class returns back an action forward object to the action servlet, and the action servlet, based on the configurations, it displays a JSP page to the user. So this is the architecture that you need to explain when someone asks about your project, right? So that is about struts. In Spring, the same old concept. JSP to web.xml to dispatcher servlet to config file to controller. After controller, what are the next steps? To the service layer, from service layer to DAO layer, from DAO layer to database back to DAO layer, from DAO layer back to the service layer, from service layer back to the controller layer, from controller layer back to dispatcher servlet, where it will take the help of internal resource view resolver and will display a JSP page back to the user. Is that clear? Very important thing. Okay, that's good. So when I say a layer is nothing but a JSP page. Sorry, a layer is nothing but a Java file where the request is flowing. See, anything and everything is exactly the same in almost every project. But in some projects there might be some additional layers in between. In some projects there might be a different set of layers. But when I say a layer is nothing but a Java file which is defined in a specific package. So since I am defining something called as a service, I'm calling that as a service layer. Since I'm defining something in a DAO package, I'm calling that as DAO layer. Okay. So in the controller, whatever I say in the controller, the first step is to get the data and also to send back appropriate views to the user. Then what is the use of a service layer? In the service layer, you write all the business logic. What is the use of DAO layer? In the DAO layer, we write all the database interactions logic only. So each layer has a specific meaning associated with them. So now the next thing that we are going to do here is we are going to get some data, which is not, we are going to set some sorry uh, classes like a service layer and a DAO layer and call them appropriately. Okay, so the login controller that I'm trying to write here, again the same old question I'm asking, what other classes it needs in this context, the login controller. Very good. The login controller in general, it needs a service class. So what is the name of the service class that we are defining? To keep the naming convention in sync, we defined the login service class name as login service. Okay. So all I say is like I say that I need an object for login service. Okay. ls. Okay, control shift O, it imports that one. Okay, now I hope everyone remembers that in ls I do have validate credentials. So what I do here is I say ls dot validate credentials and form dot get username comma form dot get password. I'm passing. Okay, now what is this? What will this return? It will return a boolean value. So now I can say if is valid, then if it is valid, return to success page, else return login. Okay, I hope everyone understood the concept here. What exactly controller is doing? controller basically validates the incoming data and decides what to do next. So if something goes wrong, go to login page. If everything is good, go to the success page or login page. Like that, it will decide. So now from here, I'm calling the validate credentials method. Now once I go to the login service, now the next question. From login service, what is the other class that I need to call? As we are discussing on layered architecture, a database class, right? Any class which has a specific database logic. And now see here, the naming convention that I'm going to use here is something like in a DAO layer, I will create a class called login DAO. Okay. So in login DAO, whatever logic I write, it's the secondary part. But the first thing that I would like to say here is I would like to call a method which will go ahead and validate the data for me. Now in the login service, all I do is I need a login DAO object. Okay, I say in the service I need a login DAO object. Now the first thing that you need to notice here is every time I try to create an object, all the objects are basically used for calling the methods in the subsequent classes, right? So now here when I say login DAO is called, let me use that login DAO, control shift O, login DAO, I need to have a method called get password, right? Now I come to my login DAO and write a method called public, which will return back a string, and the method name is get password. What is it expecting as input? String username. Okay, we'll return back something for now to resolve that error. Now we will be using Spring JDBC concept here. Okay, we'll be using Spring JDBC concept here. Now my next question to everyone, when I'm using Spring JDBC, what is that I need in a DAO class? A JDBC template. Very good. Okay, so now what I say here is I need a JDBC template, private JDBC template, JDBC template. Now using this JDBC template, I can write some logic here, right? So the logic that I can write here is, I hope everyone understands that the JDBC template will means we need to inject all the configurations into the JDBC template so that the JDBC template can talk to the database. So all I say is password from DB is equal to null, and then I say yeah, password from DB equal to, I'll get a string. Let me type cast it to string. I will use that JDBC template dot query, query for object. I will pass an SQL. So what is the SQL that I'm going to write here? Select. What is that I need? User underscore password from user table where user underscore name equal to question mark. Okay, and here I need to pass the dynamic value. So I say new object array of name. And what is the output type that I'm getting? String. Okay, this is a standard syntax that we write in general. So now see here, as we already saw the Spring JDBC template concept. So what is that we are doing? I'm using a JDBC template and say query for object and select the user password from the user table where username equal to question mark, and I'm passing the dynamic value name, the username for the first question mark, and then the output type that I'm getting is like Spring class. Okay, it's a string class output. So that is what I wrote, and I'll just return back the password from the database. Okay, password from the database. This is what I will return back. Now, in the login service, everything is good. Everything looks good. Now, let me just show one simple concept from login controller. As and when the data comes to this specific process form, we can get the username and password from the form object. So I send the same old concept. I do the same old concept like get the username and password and send it to the service method. In the service method, I call the get password in the DAO layer and I will send the username. And in the DAO layer, based on the username, I will retrieve the password and I will send the password back to the service layer. So in the service layer, again I will check. If it is not null and if it matches with the password that the user is sending, then I will return back true. If not, I will return back false. So once the request comes back to the controller decides if it is valid, take him to success page. If it is invalid, take him to failure page. So is that clear till this point? This is all the basic logic that we did till now in all the projects. Clear? Okay, good. Now the next important concept is understand my question and answer this. See, when I said that hey, there is a concept called at the rate controller or a component or a service or a repository in Spring, what happens is any class, okay, any class that is annotated with those annotations will be called by the Spring container and they will be registered as Spring beans. So if they are registered as Spring beans, then the Spring container can manage them. Now, my question to everyone, I do have many classes in my uh, project. One is login DAO, the other one is like 4 classes here, and the other one is like login form and login service. So now, out of all these classes, how many classes can be registered as Spring Beans? What's the answer? Very good. Only 2 classes can be registered as Spring Beans. Now, the next question to everyone. So everyone is clear that login controller can be registered as a Spring Bean. Now the next question is, when the login controller object is created and when once the control comes to line number 37, will there be any null pointer exception at that scenario or not? No. Okay, that's good. Now my next question. I am declaring something as at line number 19 saying that login service ls. Okay. So now once I say login service ls, my question is, will the Spring container know anything about the login service class or not? Yes or no? Okay, very good. The answer is no, which means the Spring container will never know about the login service. Okay, it will never know anything about the login service. Now, my next question. If the Spring container does not know about the login service, if that is the scenario, my next question is, can the Spring container instantiate an object for the ls at line number 19? Yes or no? Very good. The answer is no, which means my question is, since the login service, since the Spring container does not know about login service, can the Spring container do like login service ls equal to new login service, which means can the Spring container create a login service object for you, is what my question. The answer is no. Very good. So now again I am reiterating one more question. If the Spring container cannot create ls object, okay, understand my question, at line number 37, will there be any exception? Very good. Yes, there will be an exception. Okay, now my next question. Because of what there will be an exception, or why there will be an exception? Not initialized. Very good. So ls, very good. It means since ls is a variable which is not used, ls will cause a null pointer exception. Okay, anything dot will cause any null dot anything will cause a null pointer exception. Now I will go to my login service. Now understand and go through the entire class and let me know, will there be any null pointer exception in this class or not? If so, at what line? And if so, because of what? At line number 11, because of login DAO. Yes, since it is not initialized. So I am using login DAO without initializing it. Okay. Now my next question, again same old question. Inspect this class and let me know if there will be any exception in this class. If so, at what line and because of what? Line number 7. Okay, the wrong answer. Line number 7 will not cause an exception. Line number 12. Very good. Line number 12 will cause an exception. Next question. Because of what? Cannot find details of server. Okay. So simple concept. Since JDBC template is null, null dot something is exception. So that's the base concept. Okay. Because of JDBC template at line number 12, it is not initialized. Very good. It causes a null pointer exception. Now, if you go back and see the old concept of struts project or a JSP project or all old projects, we understood that whenever we try to use some objects, we always said new object and then only we used it. But in this concept, we are not using a concept of new. Okay, so that is the reason why Spring said that, hey, don't use new, I will create. That is what Spring is telling, right? Spring is telling that I will create. But what is happening in this context? Spring is unable to create something for you. Okay, Spring is unable to create. Debug on server finished. Let me just do a quick test here. I'll close some unnecessary files. I will close these two XML files I'm closing for now. Login.js files I will close. So I'll come to this one and say like Raghu and the secret. Okay. Now see here. Things are good. So I came to line number 37. Okay. So the first question to everyone. What is Spring telling? Don't use keyword new. I will create it for you. That is what Spring is telling. But now that is what even I have coded also. So what is that I did? I did not say login service ls equal to new login service. I did not say that, but rather I am just directly using ls. So once I inspect ls, it is null. So once I execute this, it will throw a null pointer exception for me. If you see the console, the exception and all, it is all null pointer exception. Okay. So now what is happening? Spring is telling that it will create, but Spring is not creating. So what is the problem? The problem here is, as a developer, when once you wrote the code, you must tell the Spring container, okay, even if you step back into our Spring Basics project, in the Spring Basics project, if you remember, each and every bean that the Spring container needs to create or maintain, what did I do? I went ahead and declared all those beans in a XML file, spring-beans.xml file, and told the Spring container to read the XML file and understand what are the classes for which it needs to create an object. But here in this project, I never told the Spring container that there is a class called login service. I did not tell that there is a class called login DAO. Also, I did not tell that there is a class called JDBC template. I did not tell my Spring. So now see here. Can I go ahead and make all these entries in a beans.xml file and read it? Yes, that's perfect. I can do that. But in real time, what we do is, instead of using all those XML configurations again, we cut short all those things and use some annotations again. Okay? We use some annotations. So what are the annotations that we use? The first thing that we use is like, we need to tell the Spring container that, hey, there are multiple classes apart from the controller. Like, apart from the controller, there are other classes like a DAO service, like that you need to tell. So how can you tell them? Do you remember initially I told that each and every class must be annotated with some annotations like @service repository and all, right? So in my service layer, I will annotate this class as @service and Control Shift O, import that, and again it is given by the Spring framework. The next one is in the DAO. I will tell it as @repository, given by the Spring framework. Again, save it. Now what happens is, my next question, once I write uh, @service and @repository, once I use these things, understand my question and answer it. Can the Spring controller read those classes, and can it understand that, hey, there are few more additional classes which I need to remember and declare them as Spring Beans? Can the dispatcher servlet do the task for us? Yes or no? With the existing configurations. Okay, yes. What about others? Yes. Okay, others. I know that everyone will tell yes, but the answer is no. Why? Because there is a simple concept here. Why? Why? Because, see, what is that I am telling in this file? In this file, I told, go ahead and scan a package called controller only. Did I tell the dispatcher servlet to scan other packages like com.easylearnjava.service and com.easylearnjava.dao? Did I tell it to scan the other packages also? I did not tell. Since I did not tell the dispatcher servlet, it cannot scan those packages and it cannot identify them as the Spring Beans. So it will not happen. So what I can do is like, I can say comma, I can say com.easylearnjava.service, comma com.easylearnjava.do. I can say that. If not, instead of writing all those things, I will do this. com.easylearnjava. This is a simple configuration I give. So what happens is, in my package, if I have 5 packages, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Out of these 5 packages, 4 packages match my configuration com.easylearnjava. So the controller package, the DAO package, model package, service package, everything will be read by the dispatcher servlet. So now again the same old question. Now, can the dispatcher servlet read all the service layer and DAO layer classes, and can it register everything as beans? Okay, very good. Yes, it can do that. So my next question, Yeah, can everyone hear me? I think yes, Adib, like everyone is able to hear. That's why you're also responding. Okay. So now my next question. So the first thing that we did here is we told the Spring container that hey, go, not the Spring container, the dispatcher servlet, that go ahead and scan all the packages and understand if there are any classes with some annotations, declare them as Spring beans. That is what I told. Okay. Now the next concept. Once I say that all those are registered by the Spring beans as Spring container as beans, it can maintain their life cycle. Now my next question. Understand my question and answer again. So now the Spring container, okay, the Spring container knows that there is something called as a login controller, login service, and login DAO. The Spring container knows about all these three things. Now my question is, once the request comes to login controller, can the dispatcher servlet make sure that the login service class is instantiated by the container? Can it happen or not? Which means, will the container create an object for login service? Yes or no? Why? Because it knows that there is a class called login service and login DO already. So what is the answer, everyone? So the concept here is okay. So the concept here is, even though the Spring container knows that there are three classes, okay, that there are three classes called a controller, service, and DAO. The concept here is the Spring container cannot inject the login service at line number 19. It cannot inject unless you tell it. Okay, do you remember in our old class, or in my previous session, we are looking into a class, or we are looking into an example where student has a book object. So when I say student has a book object, I need to inject student a book object into students. So I say auto wire by type, by name, by constructor, like that I wrote. The same way here I need to tell at line number 19 that hey, inject login service into login controller. That is the concept I need to tell. So what happens in this context is, instead of doing all those XML configurations, I will use a simple annotation called AutoWire. Control Shift O, import that AutoWire annotation. Sorry, AutoWire. So AutoWire is again a Spring configuration given and imported at line number 5. Now, what happens with this configuration is, as and when you write auto void, the Spring container, whenever it wants to create a login controller, the next moment it checks is, okay, the login controller needs a login service. So let me go ahead and search if there is any class called login service. Now, it will find a class at line number 14. Do you see com.easylearnjava.service.login service? So with this configuration, it will understand that okay, I need to inject a class called login service, which is present in this package. So it goes ahead and injects this class at line number 19, which means an object is created for you. Okay, so is everyone clear how the object at line number 20 is being created? Okay, the same way what I do is, once I go to login service, I need a login DAO object. So I go ahead and say @ auto void, control shift O. So it will inject that. The next thing I say here is I go to login DAO. I need a JDBC template. So I say at the rate auto wide control shift O. Okay, good. Now my question to everyone: will the login DAO be injected into service automatically or not? Okay, answer is yes. Very good. So if the login DAO is being injected into login service, it means login service must be instantiated. Okay. So what is the answer? Will the login service be instantiated? Yes or no? Sorry, not login service. The question is, will the login DAO object be instantiated or not? Will be created or not? Okay, that's good. It will be created. Yes. Now see here. Once I say that login DAO object is being created, login DAO internally needs a JDBC template. Now my next question is, will the JDBC template object be initialized and will it be injected into DAO or not? Yes or no? Excellent. Very good. The answer is no. Why? Because at line number 11, when I say JDBC template, I never made any configurations in this project for the JDBC template. Do you remember? Because in our old project, if you remember in our old project in Spring Basics, I told you how we need to inject a data source object into this JDBC template. So we need to do some configurations like data source configurations, everything we need to write, and that data source configurations we need to inject into this, but we did not do that. So what I will do here is, okay, what I will do here is, let me open this config file. We call the Spring Servlet. Here I will write some configurations. So what configurations? These configurations I can just go ahead and simply copy paste from my existing Spring Beans project. In Spring Beans, we have these things. Okay, now first let me only copy this one and copy it here. Control V, Control Shift F. Now the next question, I do have the data source where I can go ahead and use all those concepts like means they are all basic concepts which we already know: the driver class, the URL, the username, the password. So all these parameters that I have, I can inject into the JDBC template. Now the next question again, since I'm using at the rate auto wide, there is a different approach that I will take. Do you remember in our old program? Okay, in our old program, if I go to our old example, inside the user DAO, I had a setter method called set inject db parameters. Set inject db params. To that we are passing this data source object as a reference. But in this concept, I will not use a setter method. Rather, I will take a different approach. See here. This is again a standard piece of code that you can write, or this is a one-time setup that will be returned. So the one that I'm saying here is a bean, and an ID I can say is like template, anything. Okay, and the class is, it is a Spring given class org dot spring framework dot jdbc dot core dot jdbc, sorry, jcaps jdbc template. Okay, I will explain that. One second, just hold on, I will explain this. Okay, I say a property, the name that I use as data source, and reference is equal to data source object. This is the reference that I will be passing. Control Shift F. See here, very basic concept. The only difference is like line number 37 to 39 is pretty much new to you. Okay, so what is that we are planning to do here? Our plan is to make sure that the data source object is injected into the JDBC template that we have in the login DAO. So how to instantiate a JDBC? So for that what I do is I am using a JDBC template which is already given by the Spring framework. See, if I go into this JDBC template class, if I click into this, okay, in this JDBC template class, do you see here the class has a constructor like a JDBC template, okay, and in the JDBC template, one second, in the JDBC template class, it is taking the constructor argument as data source, okay. So ideally we are calling this line number 64, okay, and to the JDBC template we will inject the data source. So the configurations which I wrote at line number 38, what it will do is it will call the data source, it will call the JDBC template, and it will inject the data source object that I am using at this basic data source into the JDBC template. So by that what happens is, by the time you say at the rate auto wild, the Spring will, or the Spring container will create this JDBC template and will inject the template into the DAO layer. Okay, is that clear? Okay, so let me show you something which is happening in the background. Let me run it and explain it to you once. Debug as debug on server, finish. Yeah, we start it. Do an F8. Okay, now I go ahead and say nothing secret, hit enter. Okay, now see here, I am in login controller. So the Spring container knows about the login service, knows about the login DAO, knows about the JDBC template. Okay, so see here what happens when I say ls, when I just hover my mouse on ls, do you see here the login service object internally has the DAO object which is already created for you. Now if I expand the login DAO, do you notice here in the login DAO it has JDBC template which is already injected for you with the data source. So the concept here is what exactly the Spring container will do is, once the Spring container gives login controller to the user, the Spring container understands that login controller needs login service. So create an object for login service. And if it goes to login service, internally inside login service, it needs a login DAO. So create login DAO and inject into login service. And once it goes to login DAO, it knows that the login DAO internally needs a JDBC template, which means the JDBC template is again created, instantiated and injected into DAO, which means what is happening in this hierarchy, the Spring container will instantiate all the objects that we need. Okay, it instantiates all the objects that we need and will make it ready for us to go ahead and use. So we need not write new at any point of time. The Spring container will handle all these concepts. So since everything is injected, I can go ahead, validate credentials. Okay, so I did not do an F5, so it did not go into this method, but it has went and the validations are true, and it will go on display the success page back to the user. Okay, success page. Okay, let me make some changes, test it and explain you once again. Okay, see I'm removing at the rate auto void here. Okay, I'm removing at the rate auto void there. Now you go back and let me debug it once again. Let the context get reloaded. Okay, context has reloaded. Okay, now what I, oh, I just closed the class again. Sorry. So now I say Raghu Seeker. Okay. Now see here. Again, the same old concept I'm explaining. Notice about something about ls. 1 second. Okay, notice something about ls. So when I hover my mouse on ls internally has login DAO, well and good. It has created a login DAO and injected into service. Now inside login DAO, it needs something called as JDBC template. So what happened to JDBC template? The JDBC template is still null. Why? Because we did not tell auto void. So since we did not tell auto void, the Spring container did not initialize that for me. Okay, so that's what I just want to explain. What happens when I remove auto void? So this will definitely cause a null pointer exception. Okay, it causes a null pointer exception. Now the next scenario. Let me go back and say in the login DAO, I say auto void and I remove at the rate repository. Okay, I remove at the rate repository, save it. Now I want to go ahead and run it once again. Context has reloaded, well and good. Now I go back and say Raghu. No, let me do one thing first. Let me hit refresh. See here. Okay, this is what I just want you to show. Maybe let me restart the server, then you will clearly understand. I'm just going to restart the server and observe the console, everyone. Let me maximize the console. So the server is starting up. So once the server is starting up, the good thing about this Spring is it can tell us during the server startup itself if there are any exceptions during the server startup. Okay, see, something went wrong and it did not hit our login controller. Now once I maximize this one once again, see here, let me go back, go on to the top. So here, see here, what is it doing? Server startup. So server has started and it is trying to read our project. So dispatcher server, it is trying to read this all blah 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 stuff and all. It is trying to do a bean creation. Now see here, ever creating bean with the name login controller. So do you remember the concept, team? Just now I explained a concept like once the Spring tries to create login controller needs login service. Login service needs login DAO. Login DAO needs JDBC template. So the Spring creates or instantiates everything and injects one into the other, one into the other, one into the other, and makes it ready. Now let's see what is the problem. When it is trying to inject or when it's trying to create login controller, what is happening? Injection of auto void dependency failed. What exactly failed? See, could not auto void a field in login service. Inside login service, it was unable to auto void something. So login service, it is unable to inject into login controller. Why it is unable to inject that into login controller? There is a nested exception. The nested exception is error creating bean with the name login service. While creating login service, there is a problem. What is that? Injection of auto void dependency failed. What is that? It is trying to inject, and what is that it failed? So it says that it is trying to inject login DAO. Okay, and it is trying to inject this. Okay, sorry, where is that? One second. See here. It is trying to inject the login DAO and it failed. Why? Because see here, no qualifying bean of type login DAO found for dependency. Expected at least one bean which qualifies as AutoWire candidate for this dependency. Okay, dependency annotations AutoWire required true. So now, if you understand here, the Spring is complaining saying that, hey, I am looking for something which has failed. What is it looking for? It is trying to inject login service into controller which failed. So injecting the login service failed. But is it a problem with login service? Let's see. So what Spring says is, internally inside login service, it is trying to inject login DAO. So when it is trying to inject login DAO, that is where exactly it has failed. So now when I say login DAO has failed, Spring says that, hey, I am trying to look for a class called login DAO, but I did not get it. That is what the Spring container starts complaining. This is the most important thing that you need to understand. You might think that, hey, there is a class called login DAO in my project. Why the Spring container is unable to inject that login DAO at line number 12? Okay, that is my question. Can anyone, does anyone wants to answer that? Excellent answer. It cannot scan. Okay. Yes, there is a login DAO in my project. Well and good. But the first and the foremost question is, will the container know about the login DAO or not? Yes or no? The container will never know about login DAO. Why? Why? Because I just came back and removed an annotation called @service here. Since I removed that annotation, the Spring container can never understand that this is a Spring bean which the container needs to manage. Since that is removed, it fails. Now if I place it back again, it will work fine. Why? Because the Spring container understands that this is the DAO that the user wants and it can inject. Okay. So don't ever assume that since DAO is already present, it can inject automatically. That will never happen. You need to use the annotation. Yes, I using @controller also will work. There is one good thing about these things. Even if you say like @controller or the service or repository, there is nothing much as a difference. But each layer, like DAO is considered as a repository layer, so we use @repository on a DAO layer, and on the service we use something called @service, and on the controller we use @controller. Okay, okay, well, okay. So I hope, is the concept of Spring MVC clear to everyone? Okay. Concept is very easy if you try to understand it. Okay. So what I suggest every one of you is, go back, don't watch the video, don't do anything. Only just with your understanding, first write some points and try to connect each and every point. Where exactly it is going, which class, which class, which class, and how is it going, and what is the configuration you made. If you're able to do that, or if you're able to succeed in doing that, then we can always go ahead and inject all these values, call these classes, and the Spring container can maintain these things, and that helps us in understanding a simple flow. So if this flow is understood, you can go back and try the concept of registration flow in your project. Okay. The next topic in today's class would be like Hibernate, and we'll try to see like what are the advantages of Hibernate and why we need to use Hibernate and what is Hibernate. Okay. Again, before we understand the concept of Hibernate, the first thing that I want every one of you to notice is something like ORM. Okay. If you have heard about a concept called ORM, okay, a technical term called ORM, ORM basically stands for Object Relation Mapping. Object Relation Mapping. So now, before I explain this ORM, so let's see uh, some of the, I don't say disadvantages, but how the regular way of coding happens in the current world. Okay, without ORM. So if I want to fetch, okay, if I want to fetch some properties from the database, like the user password. Okay, so I say select user underscore password from user, where user uh, underscore name equal to some dynamic value, Raghu or whatever. So this is the query you write. So what exactly is written in this query? The query basically shows couple of things. The first one is user underscore password. What is this? User underscore password is a column name in the database. And then user. What is this? This is the exact table name on the database. Again, this is one more column name. Okay. So in ideally in real world, what we do is like we will write some queries which will fetch lot of columns from the database. When I say lot of columns, the scenario is like if you want to show some transaction details to the user, you will fetch a lot of transaction details saying that the transaction ID, transaction name, transaction time, transaction amount, done with the card and which shop. Means there are a lot of information that you fetch, which means there are many columns that you need to fetch from the database. If you want to write a query, every time you need to go to the database, look for the exact table name and look for the exact column, and you need to always look for all these stuff saying that hey, what are the properties, what are the column names, everything you need to understand, you need to remember, and you need to come back and code for them, right? So this is one thing which is very means I don't say tough or odd, but this might not be the right way of coding. Why? Because every time going to the database, or if you want to know something, you need to remember all the column names and all. Now, and also the other way that I can say here is, what if I want to write the same query, okay, if I want to write the same query, instead of talking in terms of a database, if I can talk in terms of Java, okay, when I say talking in terms of Java, let's understand this way. I have a table called sorry, not a table, I have a class called user. Okay, I have a class called user, where the user or user DTO or whatever. Okay, I have that class. So in that class I have some properties called user ID, name and password. So now if I can write a query in such a way that, see, I'm dealing with Java objects. See, select name or password, select password from user DTO, where name equal to Raghu. So everyone, as a Java developer, which one you feel more comfortable, the first query or the second query? The second one. Very good. Why? Why? Because the most basic stuff is since we are coding for all the classes and stuff, we know what are the classes that we have created, we know what are the properties and what each property means, right? So if I want to fetch all the data, even if I have multiple columns that I need to fetch, if I know all the properties, okay, I can even I need to go back to my Java class, but rather than going to database and doing all that stuff, it's pretty easy for you if you can code in terms of Java objects itself, right? So dealing it with the terms of objects makes it very, very easy for us. Now, that is where the object relation mapping comes into picture. When I say object, objects are nothing but maybe you can feel that user DTOs are a kind of objects. And then if I say relation mappings, all the relational tables in the database, everything is considered as some relational tables. So the user is a relational table. So defining a relationship between a Java class and a table and making few other things, it is considered as an ORM, where the object relation mappings will try to bridge a lot of gaps or differences between these relations. Okay, so this is the first one. The second scenario that I can explain here is, let us assume that on a database side you have a class called employee and something called as address. Okay, employee and address. So in a table, if you want to define a relationship between employee and address, what will you say? Like if you are familiar with the primary key and foreign key concept, employee will have an employee ID which is considered as a primary key in this table, and in address what you will do, you will say that the same old employee ID is or will be defined as a foreign key, right? So employee ID is a foreign key in address table, but employee ID is a primary key in employee table. That is how you identify the employee and address relationship. But coming to a real world in Java, you cannot define a primary key or foreign key relationships, right? All you need to do is you need to understand that, hey, if I want to do something like, or if I want to make some configurations in such a way that I want to establish a relationship, then what you do, you define an employee class, and inside an employee class you will say you need address objects. So you can declare something like private address add, something like that, which means the address is a property inside an employee class, like that you define. So there is a lot of mismatch between the way Java understands and the way the database understands. So to bridge the gap between the relational tables and the objects we deal with, we created something called as ORM, object relation mappings. So the object relation mappings that we define, what they will do is the object relation mappings will bridge the gap and will help the Java developers to develop the code in terms of the objects and their properties itself. So let us try to understand how we, instead of writing these SQL queries, how we can use these object relational queries. They are called as, means since we are dealing with a tool called Hibernate, since we are dealing with something called as the Hibernate, we will call them as HBM queries. So what is the first one that I wrote? The first query that I wrote is considered as an SQL query, structured query language. But the second query that I wrote, it will be considered as HQL, Hibernate query language. Okay. To be frank, like since most of us will start understanding SQLs, writing in SQL is what many people feel comfortable at times when compared to HQL. But HQL also does a lot of good stuff for us, which means like As in when I start programming and when I start showing some configurations, you will understand like why writing a HQL is very essential in a project for easy maintenance in the future. That is what you see in this. Okay, so now let me go ahead and start the HQL with an example called Hibernate. Hibernate is an ORM tool or a framework. Like Hibernate, iBatis is one thing which is also famous in the market. So both Hibernate and iBatis are most commonly used. So we will look into something called as an Hibernate and how we deal with stuff. Okay. So the main target is to convert all the SQLs that we deal with into HQLs and few more advantages you will understand. Or the basic thing is how to bridge the gap between the relational tables and the objects. Okay, so let me create a simple project. And I say Java project. Yeah, means I understand your question, Sai. Once I show an example, you will try to understand that as a Java developer, I no longer worry about the database. All I do is once I create a class, I deal with my class only from now onwards. Maybe this will be clear once I start explaining with an example. Okay. Sorry, I think my throat is gone. Hibernate basics. Okay. So next. So I created a Hibernate basics project and the same old scenario. If I go back to the same old easy learn Java and go to repositories, you can see a project called Hibernate Basics. So this is what we are dealing with. So let me just send this link to everyone. So even if I don't send the project that we are looking in today's class, this is the example that I'm going to explain, and all the required libraries that we deal with are already present in this one. And you need to understand one more concept here. In a dynamic web project, if you drop all the jars in a lib, it will attach into the source folder. But here I just added a meaningful folder called a lib and placed all the source files. All you need to do is like if it doesn't show up, just add all the libraries into your class path. Okay. So you can always go ahead and use this download zip and download the project to your workspace or whatever. Okay. Now the first thing is, let me add some jar files into this project so that I can view the features of uh, Hibernate to this project. So I say right click, new, sorry not new, build path, configure build path, and let me add some external jars. So I do already have the jars. That's what I just opened in one of the old projects. Okay, all these jars I will load it into my project. Okay, I've added everything into my class path. Say okay. Now if you see the reference libraries, it refers a lot of Hibernate related libraries and all that stuff. Okay, and additional required libraries. Now the second step. Once we got all the configurations, the next thing that I will go ahead and explain here is how we can deal with Hibernate or how we can make some specific configurations here. Okay. For that again I need some XML files. I will create those. I will copy these XML files. Will remove all the basic configurations and I will redo the stuff once again. Okay. So this is what I need. I will explain what I am trying to do here. But let me delete everything. I delete this. I delete this. But see, I need these configurations. I will copy paste later. Okay, because like remembering all those is like, okay, these configurations I need. Okay, just to resolve that error, I added something called as a session factory at line number 7. Okay, now the first and the foremost concept that I will explain here is, let's deal with the current class called user. Okay, let's deal with the class called sorry, table called user, and instead of writing a query like select user password from, means instead of writing an SQL, let us write something else in the form of HQLs. Okay, for that what I do is that, as I already told, the first step that I will do is I will create a Java class. Calm down. Easy learn Java dot DTO. Okay, inside this let me create a class called user DTO. So this user DTO has some fields, 3 fields, same old ID, name and password. Private int user ID, private string username, user, or just put it as name and password. Okay. Now the next concept here is like, let me add some getters and setters to this class. Generate source, generate getters and setters. So control shift. Now see here. The next concept is the next concept is when I say I do an ORM, object relation mapping. So what I do here is I would like to map the class whatever I have created here with the table. Okay, so what is the table that I have? Let me open my workbench. Let me create a package com dot java dot dao. Getting uh, sorry, I created util under this source. Oh no, I did the right thing. It's not under this. Okay. Okay. Now let me go to my uh, workbench and let me open this user table. Okay, so now the first thing that I will do here is I would like to map the user